Welcome to Recalibrate Reality, the future of New York. Our guest today is Jose Ortiz Jr., the CEO of the New York City Employment and Training Coalition, the largest city-based workforce development association in the country. Last summer, New York City unemployment rate reached as high as 20%. And while unemployment in New York City has declined since then, it is still double the national average. In this episode, Jose and I discuss how we can better prepare the city's workforce to thrive in a post-COVID world. And so now, let's recalibrate reality with Jose Ortiz Jr. Jose, welcome to Recalibrate Reality.
Thanks so much. It's great to be here with you.
Yeah, thanks for coming on the show. And so before we get into our discussion, I just wanted to take a minute so that you can give us a little bit about your background and your role with the New York City Employment and Training Coalition and its mission.
Sure. So I'm a lifetime New Yorker, born and raised in the Bronx, East Harlem, all over the city with my two brothers and my mother. So the city is incredibly important to me, as it is to you and so many of the folks that are going to be viewing this conversation. I'm currently the CEO of the New York City Employment and Training Coalition, which is the largest city-based workforce development association in the country. And we have about 180 members that provide jobs to over 500,000 New Yorkers. Our mission is to ensure that every New Yorker has access to the skills, training, and education needed to thrive in the local economy, that every business is able to maintain a highly skilled workforce. And personally, I spent 20 years and have spent 20 years in the nonprofit sector, working closely with lots of different organizations, but I spent about a decade at the 92nd Street Y, so it's a bit of coming home, and I'm just excited to be here with you.
And as a member of the RPA, so we got you on all sides, so I appreciate it, and I appreciate your commitment to public service and this important mission. So, COVID hits. Maybe if you could just share with us a little bit of how your organization had to navigate and the people that you supported during that period had to navigate through COVID.
Over the last year, I'm sure it's been covered in your discussions before, and you're very well aware of it. But obviously, the current state of New York City's workforce is really difficult, and the job losses alone are twice as large as the rest of the United States. In the beginning of the pandemic, we brought together a working group called the New York City Workforce Recovery Strategy Group. And we brought in about 70 organizations, 80 leaders from those organizations to draft what was a blueprint, and really the first of its kind during the beginning of the pandemic. I think we really wanted to create some space for our community, for our partners, to really take a non-siloed approach. And we wanted to get ahead of really the recovery effort discussions. And in our minds, what was important was that we were doing a good job of really identifying workforce as where people meet businesses. And we brought together all those leaders to create a blueprint, which we call Recovery for All, that really currently informs our strategies.
And how does the people part, how do they actually source you? How do you get connected with the people that are looking for the skills and to be connected with the jobs?
So think of us as any chamber. Our organization is really representing the organizations that provide the training. So when workers find us, we connect them to organizations that are directly providing the services within their community. And that's 180 member organizations that we work closely with that are providing those job training programs or degrees within a CUNY or a SUNY. So we want to first and foremost make sure that we are doing our best to understand what the skill sets are that these individuals have, where their interests are, and where they want to be aligned in terms of jobs. We don't want to look at it as simply as a job and a re-entry point into the economy. We want to think of it as a pathway for them to grow into a career, one that's going to be sustainable and less potential for fracturing when there are massive shifts in the economic climate.
Yeah, and as we've now started to recover from COVID, and obviously this recovery has been a lot stronger than many of us have predicted. How have you seen? Have your members been able to be matched to good employment opportunities?
So it's the answer is yes and no. I think a lot of the organizations that we work very closely with and the people that they're serving are really assessing a couple of things. One, how has the impact of COVID been on one, the businesses that they had previous relationships with? How has that impacted the acceleration of the future work and other pieces there? And we can talk about that a little bit later, but how does that impact their ability to train people within the current confines of the programs that they've developed over the many years. What do they need to do to pivot in order to respond to growth sectors and or changes within the workforce? But people are finding jobs, and also obviously people are still out of the workforce for a variety of different reasons, whether it's training and a lack of investment into those training programs because the city or the government in general is not investing at the level that they should be. Is it a lack of access to supportive services that they require? We have seen that obviously women in particular have been more heavily impacted during this particular crisis, and which has come to in many ways some of the tension around the redefining of what infrastructure means, because childcare is absolutely vital. Right, it's absolutely vital. There are just folks that simply cannot return to work because of that fact. So people are finding work, they're being trained, but there's a significant portion of the population that requires reskilling today. And that is a massive investment that needs to come down from the federal level all the way down to our city to ensure that we recover, because as you know, if we don't recover effectively, that's going to have massive implications on the state and the nation.
It's as you think through this recovery, and this is one of the things that's concerned me, right, is that it feels like we have this V-shaped recovery from a macro perspective, but when you look below the surface, this is more like a K-shape, except that the V-shaped is so pronounced because of the white-collar jobs, the finance jobs, technology jobs are doing so well, but it's that the people that have been underserved or not as well positioned to actually be able to get jobs in a post-COVID world that are suffering, right? And I get concerned that the stronger the economic recovery is, the more those people will be forgotten, and it's going to be much more challenging to actually have those jobs created for them.
Yeah, I mean, you share the same concerns that I do. I think the massive acceleration out of this particular period of time, really, it's not about slowing that down, but it's about putting the right things into place in order to position people well. And I think you talk about like where the jobs are coming, which jobs were more resilient, and you look at the populations that we often serve, which are the most marginalized populations in New York City. They were the ones that either fell out of the workforce or were in the essential category during those periods of times, and those are not necessarily experiencing increasing wages. They don't necessarily have the types of job protections that would ensure that people can come back to work rapidly. They don't have certain supportive services around them. And even if they currently exist in the manner in which they had previously existed before, we really need to think about upskilling and reskilling them for what is now the future of work, or what is to come over the next 10 years, because it's not as if the acceleration of technology is going to stop at what's happened during the pandemic. That will continue to happen. That will continue to have implications on the people that we serve. And ultimately, about what workforce is really about ensuring that these individuals and the people we serve can contribute to the workforce and the economic recovery in a way that we all want them to, and they want to themselves.
Yeah, I was actually just going to hit that point, right, which is that with COVID has been such an accelerant. We've seen 10 years of change in 10 months, and so the skills and what work means in a post-COVID world is very different than it was in a pre-COVID world. So can we dig into that a little bit more about in terms of your view on that and how you're now changing strategies to help people prepare for that post-COVID world?
So you're articulating a point that I've been speaking about really since over the last 15 months and right at the beginning of the pandemic. There has been so much research that has pointed towards the future of work over the next 10 years or before 2030 as having massive implications on specific jobs and job sectors. It was something that was pressing for our community beforehand, where we needed to think about, okay, what are the skills that we're currently providing? Which of those skills will align themselves to the jobs of the future? And where do we get, what do we need to do to supplement that in the meantime as, people are growing from, let's say a job to a good job to a career? All of that just essentially, all the research was thrown out the window because no one could have ever imagined the impact of the pandemic on those technological advances. Companies, in order to survive and to do well, had to really accelerate some of these pieces that they had in place already. And so, our organizations now are doing a lot of what I just described, which is They're really examining and trying to spend as much time as possible with employers to understand what those talent needs are. What, if anything, remains true from the curriculum that had previously been developed by these institutions, small, medium, large scale organizations, from small community-based organizations that are providing training in, let's say, in the food and hospitality sector, which was devastated during this period of time, to curriculums or course loads that are being provided through different community colleges in the city. So we see obviously that investments need to be made into specific sectors like tech sector, like financial services, like healthcare, green jobs, those that have been particularly resilient during this period of time. However, we also need to pause and make sure that there's value to those who work in roles that provide essential services, because those are the need for those services are not going to go away. We still have that. We are going to have that during the most technologically advanced times in our society. And we need to value those positions as well. So training will continue to exist and should continue to exist in those areas, but we need to accelerate our shift towards some of these more technological positions over the next 10 years.
And when you think about those positions, because you would think of it more historically, there's been a lot of value placed on the 4-year degree and the college degree versus more of skill-based training. And do you think that particularly at this point in time, there should be a shift to more skill-based training with the view that you can have a life of learning subsequent to that, but at least you're not spending years in college, maybe taking on debt, and as the world's moving so quickly, may not have the skills to be to actually get the job you want anyway by the time you're done?
First and foremost, not everyone needs to go to college, and that's not going to achieve the level of success that I think we've historically connected to getting a degree. And some people, given on their interest level and the values they have, are not particularly aligned to pursuing that route. So we are very much in line with we're meeting people where they are. What is it that they want? What is it that they want to do? And how will they be successful in that particular pathway? But we're very much also supportive of a skills-based approach. Many companies obviously at this point have done the necessary assessments of their talent needs and can say that while they may want someone who has a degree because there may be a cultural component of it or something that feels more closer to what their needs are within their company, in truth, if this individual is trained and provided specific skills that can meet the talent needs of our company and our operations today, then we can still be successful. And so we're very much about a skills-based approach and ensuring that people can get into the workforce fast, but also get into the workforce effectively so that they can remain a part of it and grow and advance within those companies. But there is more work to be done, I think, in terms of the companies themselves also. Not just identifying internally whether or not that they can hire somebody who just simply has a skills-based training, but also doing a good job of removing those barriers that exist within the companies themselves to hiring somebody whose only background is really a skills-based approach versus a higher education approach. That has to be revisited.
And it's not only, I think, on the hiring part, right? It's got to be the support once they are hired to be mentored and continue to have a path to grow and gain additional skills on site. So I really do think, to your point, this has to be not only a public side, but there's got to be a private sector commitment if we're going to be able to do this effectively.
We have to take a much more holistic approach to it, and we can't put the onus on the organizations that are providing the training if the employers are not willing to really not just work with those organizations that are providing training for these populations, but also once the training is provided, be able to actually place them into these companies and make sure that they're successful. It has to be a dual approach, and we need to work together to really achieve that. But a strong and equitable recovery in New York City requires that we're doing that. Otherwise, you're going to continue to see the positions that we see specific communities in right now, which is some being uber successful and responding well to the reopening of our city, and which we want. but we also want to, at the same time, ensure that people can, remain competitive.
One thing that's come up a couple of times that people talk about is that, right, we're having this challenge of some of the record unemployment. At the same time, we have a record numbers of jobs that are unfilled, and I guess there's different views as to why that is. Some people say it's because that we have the federal support programs that increased unemployment, that people aren't incented to work. Some people say that there's the question as to what we're just talking about. People don't have the skills for where the jobs are. And I guess some people would say that the companies that are trying to hire, that can't hire, aren't paying a high enough wage to incent people to come to work. Do you have a view on that?
These types of programs de-incentivize individuals' ability to work or their interest in working is, I think, just one part of the problem. I think childcare, as I mentioned earlier, is a massive issue here. I think obviously wages continue to be an issue, and quality is an issue as well in terms of jobs. So we really need to take a more holistic understanding of it, an approach to solving that problem and that challenge in terms of getting people back in the workforce and getting companies the talent they need.
To maybe shift from the people to the community piece for a second, because
Sure.
particularly when you think about essential workers, and you referenced hospitality sector and restaurants, one of the challenges is that such a large part of that industry was decimated during COVID and has not yet come back. And right, and I think that, and as we think going forward, there are structural changes that are going to impact New York's communities, whether that's in Midtown or downtown in the CBDs, where there's going to be less people coming to work, which means there's going to be less people to service the restaurants, less people to service the small businesses. And so really to be able to have those essential jobs, you really need to have that whole ecosystem working. And so have you given thought in terms of that element of this, which is how do we make sure that the communities are functioning effectively and creating those jobs that every hardworking man and woman could apply for?
I mean, I think that one of the things I referenced earlier is particularly in the report that we did with Recovery for All is we need to get small businesses back up and running in New York. We need to provide every bit of support that we can to ensure that they can be successful. There's a domino effect with each one of these pieces. And obviously, if we're not getting businesses back up and running, people are not coming into the city as much, and they're not accessing their offices, and they're not shopping, they're not buying food at the local grocery and having lunch at the local restaurant, and has massive implications on whether or not the city can be successful. But in terms of, also what's important is in the process of doing so, when we think about how we build community from the ground up, not just from a business standpoint, but also from an inhabitant standpoint, we need to ensure that we are investing deeply into these communities so that we can get the type of pipeline development and training pipeline development so that people can get into those jobs and help them recover and help them grow within the community and remain as a part of the fabric of that community. So when we think of communities, we're really thinking about how do we invest more effectively and align workforce and economic development to each other? Where is it that we can do a better job of ensuring that when there are efforts to redesign or rezone or recreate communities, that we are making sure that individuals that are part of that remain a part of that fabric? What are we doing to develop the infrastructure within it so that businesses want to call that particular community home and are less likely to flee for another one that is going to incentivize them more appropriately? So that's our connection to it. But we're deeply concerned in the same ways that you are about how reopening is not about simply us doing so in the manner in which that we have grown accustomed to. We have to be very intentional and very targeted about how we're supporting the businesses, the owners, the workers, and everyone that contributes to that particular community.
Because it all, again, ties to that ecosystem, right? I mean, even to the extent you think, and you made the point about economic development, if we don't have strong economic development in communities, whether that was Queens, for example, where Amazon was going to be built, and then the jobs, and again, you have to be intentional. You have to make sure that you deal with some of the risks of people that are living there being maybe squeezed out, but that you really want to be focused on on having, if you're going to have an economic generator, that's something that you can latch onto, and then, make sure that you're protecting the people and offering more equitable opportunities for the people that live there. Even as I think through government work, right? I mean, one of the things that worries me as a solution to try to create jobs is creating just government jobs that aren't necessarily funded with permanent dollars, right? We have this big infusion of dollars from the federal government that has come in, but at some point that runs out. And if we're hiring people for projects that ultimately don't carry on, what do we do? So when you think about government jobs, do you distinguish between permanently funded jobs versus jobs that are sort of funded by these, one-timers?
I mean, when we think of government, we think about it more in terms of like, what can the government do to support the particular populations? I think obviously there's, it's not something that we can, remove from the conversation in terms of them being an employer. New York City is the largest employer in New York City, right? So we have to ensure that, any of those jobs are being filled by individuals that are well-trained and well-positioned to help the city grow. And that we're not putting people in a position where they can't be successful, or that the jobs themselves are not necessarily sustainable in the long term. We're really more focused on small business and private sector positions, because for us, that's going to create the type of economic growth and success for individuals in New York City that we hope to achieve. And certainly, while we we support and work very closely with some of our members who are individual organizations like DC 37, which is largest union in the city for municipal workers, and others that provide training for those positions. We see the city as really helping more around the types of things that we were just focusing on around small businesses, and ensuring that they're providing possibly some wage subsidies to support small businesses that they're reopening, or doing the necessary work that they have to in terms of closing the digital poverty gap, which was obviously a huge issue during this particular period of time. Or what can they do to just increase small business participation in the workforce development system?
One of the, I think, the big policy debates, right, is it's been growth versus equity versus growth for equity. And, as you weigh into that narrative, do you find some ways that help resonate that point, that, that if you are able to have growth done correctly, that's how you drive equity?
So I think, this has been one of the biggest questions for us as an organization over the last couple of years. And you referenced the Amazon conversation as well. We're right now, along with our partners, Regional Plan Association and Association for Neighborhood Housing, recently launched an effort called the New York City Inclusive Growth Initiative. We don't believe that growth should not occur, and that we should not be a city that is supportive of businesses, that is a place that is businesses want to consider themselves home. We also, however, believe that we fundamentally need to shift how we think about what that looks like. So with this particular initiative, our goals are obviously to retain good jobs, to expand affordable housing, but make sure that the city continues to drive forward in a way that reduces those structural inequities that we've already covered. So the ways that we're doing that right now is that we've selected an incredible group of folks with the support of our foundations who are actively supporting our work, the Robin Hood Foundation, JP Morgan Chase, and the Ford Foundation. And we selected 18 leaders who are emerging within their different categories of work. But the effort here is to take a much more holistic approach. While the agenda that we think that we need to support or develop is focused on workforce, economic development, and housing, we also need to think about the other intersectional areas that often make it, will determine whether someone is successful. And so we think about education, we think about infrastructure, transportation, poverty, but other issues like social justice, gender, sexual identity, immigration, climate and sustainability, and thinking about how those individual areas will impact the ability for someone to be successful in their community. So the agenda will be focused on those three main areas of housing, workforce, and economic development, but it'll be more properly informed by the other things that will often determine whether or not somebody is supportive of economic development in their community.
Yeah, I think that's critical to have a holistic approach like that, because it is, as we've discussed, interconnected and trade-offs, right? And when people are making policies, if you're not aware of all the different elements of it, you're not understanding what you're sacrificing for what you're gaining. And so And
Yeah,
that's important.
that's right. And I mean, I think the real issue is that the more of these issues that are fractured for any individual or their family, the less inclined they are to see themselves as a part of the city and the effective city that we hope to grow and the effective city that many of us live in. But for others, it appears to be something very different. And so if that continues to be an issue for more and more folks in the city, we cannot achieve the level of success. We can't have a stable system. And that puts all the entire system and our entire economy at risk.
One of the things that strikes me as we're having this conversation is a sense of civic responsibility more business leaders should take towards thinking about having an inclusive workforce. We were focused as we were shut down, realizing that if people aren't coming back to the workplace when it was safe to do so last summer, and obviously taking the precautions, what that impact was going to be on the small businesses, the restaurants, and their ability to survive, and why it was, again, a civic responsibility to do that. Same, I think there's a psychology, and we do it as well, and I think it's been great, which is as veterans return, bringing them into our workforce. But you would think that this the message of hiring inclusively throughout our community, hiring locally, working on that job training to create paths of growth should be something that the private sector should be wearing as a badge of civic responsibility as we move forward.
Yeah, I think that's true. I mean, listen, I think over the last year, we saw the private sector respond in an incredible way, particularly towards the racial and social injustice that was occurring and that had become more prominent as a result of the murders of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, and also really our eyes being more focused on these issues as a result of us being at home and really frustrated about how the system was operated. And so I saw incredible support for Black, Brown, and AAPI communities and companies of all scales really stepping up. However, when you talk about it from the purposes of training, we need, the recognition is just the first step of this challenge. I think from the leadership all the way down to their hiring teams, companies need to commit to playing an active and not passive role in the solution. And so we need them to move beyond the initial pledge to hire more non-traditional candidates and take a hard look at company culture and whether or not there's institutional bias and hiring practices that can be actively eliminated within those communities. Or if there isn't one of those things, what can we simply do better today to ensure that we are bringing not just hiring folks, but playing an active role in the way that you described, an active role in how we build talent from the ground up.
So just a final question. We have a mayor race coming up in a few weeks. We have the primary who will likely select our next mayor. And you hit people, community, and systems, right? And so whoever that next mayor is going to drive systems and policies that ultimately are going to impact the people in the community as you go forward. If the next mayor called you and said, Jose, give me an idea of, one, how do I do the most to help the people? And two, how do I do the most, what kind of policy I put in place to help the small businesses in this time of need? What would your two recommendations be? First
and foremost, we need to really provide value to training in general. I think there's, more often than not, there's an investment into the supportive services that I referenced that are really important to people. We need to have strong and affordable housing. We need to have individuals that are food secure. We need to develop specific subsidies to support populations in order for them to survive in the city. But in order for them to thrive, we have to really understand that training is really that intersection between people and the economic recovery, or people and the businesses. And so a significantly deeper investment into workforce where it aligns to infrastructure development and projects that are going to help the city recover and grow and be a city of the future, I think is the first recommendation. I think we also need to really think about the magnitude of the problem. I mean, hundreds of thousands of people remain out of work. And so we need to develop and redesign the system to effectively get people back to work immediately, but also at the same time, provide that training so that they can grow and advance within those companies. That's absolutely a must with regards to training. In terms of businesses, and particularly small businesses, we got to remove any red tape that we can in order to make sure that they feel supported, that they feel like they can continue to grow their business during what has been the most challenging time that they, if any, all of them have experienced during this period of time. And I go to the local restaurants and the local businesses in my community in downtown Brooklyn, and just seeing the boarded up businesses and the places that I've grown accustomed to growing and spending time with my kids and my wife, it's devastating. So whatever we can do to ensure that they can reopen, removing all necessary red tape, as I mentioned, providing incentives so that they can rehire people back into some of these positions, and providing subsidies for them to do so for a short period of time as they continue to grow their business and stabilize, which is really fundamentally important. So those are really the things that I would think about. But additionally, all the other areas that I mentioned, again, in terms of making sure that people can learn and earn from home, the digital divide. I can't think of, maybe without besides childcare, I can't think of another thing that was so prominent during this period of time that actively affected people's ability to be able to just continue to work from home or be a part of the economy. So that type of infrastructure development has to happen as well. So there's, the point that I'm raising is that there's probably there's a lot. It's hard to narrow and focus in on one. But we need to take an approach that really addresses all three of those needs. Otherwise, we are going to find ourselves in a very similar place when we experience an economic downturn in the future, which is inevitable, right? There's always going to be a downturn, and there's always going to be a recovery. And each time we need to really think about how we ensure that people remain a part of that process.
Yeah, well, I think as we're, living through this post-COVID world, it's clear what existed yesterday is not going to be tomorrow, and that the policies that are put forward need to be bold and deep, like the ones that you're suggesting. I think we can't look at the playbooks of the past. We have to think about the playbooks of the future. And I commend you and your colleagues for the efforts that you're making, because as you speak about this, you really think about the investment you're making in people's lives, right? It's not about putting food on their plate or giving them a fish. It's teaching them how to fish. And even with these small businesses that have suffered so tremendously to no fault of their own, giving them the confidence and the initial support to reopen and help revitalize our communities is critical as well. So thank you, Jose. Thank you for joining us today, and thank you for your hard work on this.
Thank you, Scott. I appreciate your time. It's great to be with you.
Great. Thank you. That concludes this week's episode of Recalibrate Reality. In order to rebuild New York that is more sustainable and more equitable than it was before, equipping our city's workforce with the necessary skills to thrive post-COVID must be a part of the equation. Thank you again to Jose Ortiz and the New York City Employment and Training Coalition. Thank you to the Regional Plan Association and the 92nd Street Y. And thank you to the team for making this week's episode possible. From 75 Rockefeller Plaza in New York, I'm Scott Rechler. See you next week.